Welcome to Shift, a college admissions ACT, SAT, and CLT podcast for a changing world. I'm Tyler, the founder of Achievable, and we have an affordable ACT course that includes everything you need to ace your test. A full textbook, tons of ACT questions backed by our memory-enhancing algorithm, videos on key topics, a built-in study planner, and full-length practice exams. You can get a free trial at achievable.me, and if you like it, code podcast gets you 10% off at checkout. Now, let's get started. Today, we've got Lori Goldstein from Circle Test Prep with us. And Lori, excited to have you on the show. I'd love if you could introduce yourself.
Thanks, Tyler. I'm glad to be here. I am a test prep person in South Florida, located between Miami and Fort Lauderdale. I just do SAT and ACT prep, and that keeps me pretty busy down here.
Yeah, fantastic. So I'm curious now that we are kind of looking back at a couple of rounds of the digital SAT being administered. What are the things that we've learned, right, in sort of this brave new world?
Mm-hmm. Well, I think the first thing we've learned is that the initial practice tests on Bluebook, test 1 and test 2, are not really accurate reflections of what you're actually going to see on test day. But that's typical for the SAT. You know, what they put out at first and what it evolves into when they get more data turns out to be, always has turned out to be different every time they've changed a test.
Yeah. Well, that is it's a little like scary, right? Because you're relying on those Bluebook tests to kind of give you some sort of accurate representation. But yeah.
Yeah, it's not. I mean, the later Bluebook tests, then they added 3 and 4, and more recently they added 5 and 6 now. So the other ones, in my opinion, are more like the actual test.
Yeah. Okay. So then focus on using like the most recent ones if you're practicing.
For sure.
How do you feel like things went overall? Do you feel like the digital format was pretty well received? And obviously I think the shorter time was well received, but the adaptive format as well.
Well, I think the students are getting used to it. They certainly seem to be happy with it. You know, they're happy that it's a shorter test, that's for sure. And, mostly it's going well, although we certainly heard of a number of, technical glitches in various schools and various equipment. And that's a little disconcerting. It's terrible to have a kid take a test they prepared for, and then they go in to take it and their test just gets lost, or their computer doesn't work. They show up with a computer that's got an almost dead battery and they can't plug in, all of that kind of stuff.
Yeah, it just really adds to the anxiety, I bet, if that's even if they do fix the problem, then they're all frazzled.
Exactly. Yes. Yeah. Even if they do fix the problem, by that time they're just frazzled and they can't even concentrate. So, I mean, just the last test I had a student, basically took her mother's laptop instead of hers to the test. And it was the wrong laptop, because before the test, you have to go in and do a setup from home. And that was that. She couldn't take the test. So.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah. And this is the kind of stuff that happens when you're, staring down this super important test you've been preparing for, and you're kind of freaking out, right?
Yeah. I mean, it's given, they're given frequently, but still it was a disappointment. But yeah, we've heard stories of schools' Wi-Fi going down, so they couldn't give the test. People having issues with their own computers, or just uploading the scores. Sometimes the scores are not captured properly. But I would say it seems to me that's a small percentage, probably 5% or less, that most of the students seem to go through it pretty seamlessly.
Okay. That's good. Yeah, I mean, what are the other big things that we've learned? Just, in terms of either the difficulty or kind of maybe the way that the new questions are being received, things like that.
Right. Well, when we talk about the reading first, that's very different from the old tests. The old test had longer reading passages and then had the grammar section separate. Now it's all together. We're back to, vocabulary, those vocabulary lists and vocabulary flashcards, especially if you get the harder module. Well, even if you get the easier one, there are tough vocabulary words. And, they had gone away from that and done more vocabulary in context. So the words weren't quite as, difficult or as esoteric as they are now, but kids have to do those vocabulary lists. I mean, that's key. The transitions can be very difficult. And the reading.
What do you mean by the transitions?
Yeah, well, they test transition words towards the end, and I think this is for all of the reading section now. It requires very close reading. You have to read every word carefully, because if you don't catch, for instance, the word that said, where it said at first this happened, right? Then you're not going to pick next as the correct transition word to the next sentence, right? That's just an example. So it's all close reading.
And careful reading.
And careful reading, yes. And picky reading. It's very picky. And then in the second module, it can get into some very hard to read passages. I mean, they're short, but they're dense and they're hard. That can be very hard to understand. A lot of science vocabulary, that is just a little dense for students to get to. So the reading section initially seemed like it would be kind of easy, because wow, we got short passages instead of these long passages that were written 200 years ago that take up a whole page. But now they're shorter, but you got to read them very carefully. And you're reading on a computer screen, which is a little bit different. I would suggest all students practice working on a screen. Reading on a screen can be different as well.
Yeah, can you expand more on that? Like how does that kind of change what's going on? Is it like, I assume you can still do some sort of scratch paper or other notes or things like that, right?
Well, there's a highlighting tool, which is great. And I always encourage my students to use it in the reading section. I think that helps a lot. And you're supposed to have scrap paper from the start so you can make notes, although students don't tend to do that. And sometimes they don't hand out the scrap paper at the right time, but hopefully they'll get better at that. I think, there's a lot of theories about why it's different reading on a screen than on paper. But the one that resonates with me most closely is that students are reading on their phones or on their screens. They're reading, Instagram, or they're reading, short things, things that are not serious on their laptops. And so there's sort of this thing that you think, well, if it's on a screen, I don't have to read it carefully or seriously.
Right.
They're not used to reading serious material on a screen. But with practice, you shift your sort of mindset about it, and you realize you have to read that as carefully as you're reading something on a piece of paper. So again, practice.
Right.
And practice reading it on a screen.
Yeah, and just also the mindset component of it too, right? Yeah, I think that's pretty important. What have we learned about the scoring, right? I mean, there was initially some reports after the first administration that basically the new SAT was easier, but then as people kind of got their scores, they were like, well, I mean, I thought it was easier because I must have gotten the easy second section or something like that.
Oh, yeah.
But I'm just curious, do you feel like the score curve has shifted in any direction, or just any thoughts on kind of how it's scored?
It has. I mean, it has. It's if you research the percentiles, it is now a smaller percentile that will get, let's say above 1500, and an even than the previous paper test. And same with all those high scores. I think especially at the high end, I think they're consciously trying to, make sure there are not so many, or that not that they care that there are
there's
not so
like
many,
more
but they want to
disparity on
separate.
the top end.
Right.
Yeah.
They want to have some more separation between the kids who can get 1500 and the kids who can get 1590. So, it used to be you would need 1550 to apply to, let's say, MIT. Maybe you don't need quite that score anymore because it's, that percentile is the old percentile, the one with 1550 now is aligned with 1520. So there is. And yes, the students came out of the PSAT in the fall saying, wow, that was easy. And I just kept thinking to myself, well, yeah, you got the easier second module for both. So it seemed easy. And then they got their scores and they realized that it was not so easy. So, but they're adapting.
Yeah. And like, how do you feel the impact is for those people, or just like on, like, I'm trying to understand and kind of think of the ramifications of like the fact that you're like, oh, this test was easy because you got, and then you find out it's because you got the easy second section. So then like the next time you're taking the test, if the questions are easy, you're kind of second guessing yourself, right? Do you feel like, is that becoming a problem for your clients?
Not really. Most of my students, and it's not just me, it's most tutors, it doesn't take a lot to get into the harder section. And so the kids are mostly just getting the harder sections in practice anyway. So I tell them to expect that. I would have thought it would be a little bit more difficult to get into the harder section, but that's not how they did it. I mean, they made it, if you get, I don't know, half of the questions right, or probably 2/3 of the questions correct, you'll get the harder section. Somewhere between a half and 2/3, I think. So, but yeah, the kids are worrying about that. And of course, there's nothing you can do about it. You just, I'm sure you tell your students, like I do, the only thing to worry about is just try to get every single question right, basically, as many as you can. It's a numbers game. And even get as many right as you can.
And if they're easy, maybe it just means you're doing really well. Who knows?
Yeah. Sometimes it seems easy, but you're understanding it. But the reading comprehension questions, and I'm talking about the ones about how do we logically complete the text, what backs up the claim, what weakens the claim, what data, finishes the sentence. Those questions can get very difficult in the second reading module. And again, it requires that close reading. Especially I think to the question at the end, right? If they're asking about Australia and the question at the end asks about something in Australia, but the whole text was talking about Australia and the United States, make sure you pick an answer that's just about Australia. If that's what the question is, or that's what they're discussing at the very end there.
Yeah.
And that's exactly. The careful, you have to just be so careful.
Yeah, that makes sense. And given that you've now gone through a couple cycles with students, is how you're having them prepare for the SAT changing at all? Like whether it's like very specific to like preparing for different types of questions, or like more general strategy?
Well, I think when you take, I always tell my students to expect to take 2 tests. So the first test, will give us an idea of what we need to work on for the second test. So in some ways, yes. I mean, if they scored lower on the math, let's say, than they had been in practice, and that I think they're capable of, then we make a little more emphasis on the math, because most schools will super score them, of course. But yeah, I mean, we do practice. They have to just practice with the material, practice with the questions, and find material that is very closely aligned with the real SAT, because there's a limit to how much, there's a limit to how much real SAT material there is out there. But there's a lot of good practice available.
Great. Yeah. And then what else, what haven't we covered yet that you want to make sure we talk about today on this topic?
I'm sensing that it is that the reading, I don't know. Let me think for a second. I mean, it is getting harder to get above 1,500. I think we're all seeing that. We're all hoping that College Board will provide more practice tests soon.
Right.
Although they have said 2025 for that.
Yeah. Yeah.
So
that's a little ways away.
Yeah. It looks like we're stuck with 1 through 6 at this point. But they have provided a very good question bank that the students have access to through College Board. And those are all good questions to practice with.
Yep, absolutely.
Yeah. SAT's explanations often leave something to be desired. And the explanations don't tend to include how you can solve it with Desmos.
Right.
Yeah.
I think that there's definitely still some, you've got to kind of go over the questions with your student almost.
Oh, always. I don't rely on their explanations for anything. But if the kids are not working with a tutor, if they're working on their own, if they don't understand the explanation, ask a friend, or ask your teacher. Maybe they have a better way of explaining it to you.
Yeah, or look for it on Khan Academy or something.
Look for something similar in Khan Academy, or, get familiar with Desmos. There's lots of free videos out there, and see if maybe the key is really just using Desmos properly to solve it. But as we said earlier, it's only useful for a handful of questions, in my opinion, probably less than 10 in every test. You have to know your math as well.
Yeah, exactly. And it's also just, you shouldn't ever be relying on it. It should just be a way to do things faster. Is kind of the way that I think about it.
Yeah. Yes. I mean, the question is are there any questions that can only be solved on Desmos? I don't think so. You just have to be able to do your math, but maybe it's quicker that way.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, great. Anything else before we wrap up here today?
Maybe talk about the calculators a little bit. I have some opinions on that.
Yeah, let's do that.
Right. So they've included the Desmos calculator, which is, a pretty powerful graphing calculator that's right there at your fingertips. And then I see a lot of students come in and they bring their own calculators, which are also graphing calculators. And I tend to think that the students are better just leaving their graphing calculators at home and bringing a simpler scientific calculator with them, because that will do, a lot of calculations more quickly and easily. And, you already have, why have 2 graphing calculators? So, I mean, I use one that is really good for things with fractions and decimals and things like that, but you can find your own scientific calculator, and it seems simpler to have that on your desk and the graphing calculator on the screen to me.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And I mean, I think it's also just like at a certain point, it's helpful to not try and be unique and to just like eliminate one extra variable from your test taking experience, right?
Yeah, and that's why a simpler calculator for doing simpler, things and doing fractions and things like that might be a better way to do it.
Yeah. Yeah, that's a great tip. Anything else you wanted to cover today?
No, I think that's it.
Great. Yeah, this is really good information. Thank you.
You're welcome.
This has been Shift, a college admissions podcast for a changing world, hosted by Tyler from Achievable with Lori Goldstein from Circle Test Prep. You can get a free trial of Achievable's ACT course by going to achievable.me and using the code podcast to get 10% off at checkout.